January 6, 2021 ought to be treated with the reverence and solemnity of September 11th, 2001. But President Trump treats it like a joke. It was, without hyperbole, an insurrection against this country, an attempted coup, a bona fide attempt to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. And it was the most violent attack on the Capitol since 1814. And yet, now re-elected President Trump has made a mockery of the attack on our country and our democracy by pardoning 1,500 traitors involved and commuting the sentence of 14 others, including violent felons who attacked law enforcement officers on their way to invading the Capitol. President Trump is not a member of a party of law and order.
If you committed violence on that day, obviously you shouldn't be pardoned.
But the president does not like people that abuse police officers either.
So this is January 6th, approximately 1,500 for a pardon.
Yes.
Full pardon.
Here's how the Congressional Research Service described what happened. On January 6, 2021, a crowd gathered on U.S. Capitol grounds, breached police barriers, entered the Capitol building, occupied portions of the building for an extended period of time, and clashed with law enforcement, resulting in at least 5 deaths, dozens of injuries, and damage to federal property. Multiple participants in the unrest allegedly carried firearms and used flagpoles and other objects as weapons, and explosive devices were discovered on or near the Capitol complex. Members of Congress and the Vice President, who were in the process of fulfilling their constitutional duty of counting the 2020 presidential election electoral votes, were forced to evacuate in response to the unrest. And now, because of his re-election and recent decisions by the Supreme Court, we will likely never know the extent to which President Trump would have been found criminally guilty for his part in trying to subvert democracy on that day. Now, for a time, even Republicans recognized the horror that Donald Trump had brought. Right after the insurrection on the Senate floor on January 6, Republican Senator Mitch McConnell said,
"The people who stormed this building believed they were acting on the wishes and instructions of their president. And having that belief was a foreseeable consequence of the growing crescendo of false statements, conspiracy theories, and reckless hyperbole, which the defeated president kept shouting into the largest megaphone on planet Earth."
Republican Senator Mitt Romney wrote, quote, "We gather today due to a selfish man's injured pride and the outrage of his supporters, whom he has deliberately misinformed for the past 2 months and stirred to action this very morning. What happened here today was an insurrection incited by the President of the United States." Republican Senator Richard Burr from North Carolina said, quote, "The president bears responsibility for today's events by promoting the unfounded conspiracy theories that have led to this point." On January 11th, a few days later, Trump had a phone call with House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, where Trump blamed it on Antifa. Kevin McCarthy said, quote, "It's not Antifa, it's MAGA. I know, I was there." A few days after that, on January 19th, Mitch McConnell on the Senate floor said, quote, "The mob was fed lies. They were provoked by the president and other powerful people." He then voted yes for a second impeachment. But now, of course, according to President Trump, the insurrectionist traitors were perfectly innocent, and it was the police officers who protected members of Congress that were the real bad guys. Yes, Trump and his allies have actually vowed retribution against Officer Mike Fanone and the other officers who testified before the January 6th committee. In a statement accepting a preemptive pardon from then-President Biden, Officer Fanone noted that, quote, "Now we live in a country where the president can weaponize every institution to destroy American lives, and he can do it with impunity because the Supreme Court has designated him a king and not a president. This is a different kind of American exceptionalism. It's exceptionally fucked up." In contrast, President Trump's 1,500 pardons include Peter Steger, who was recorded striking a Metropolitan Police Department officer with a flagpole bearing an American flag at least 3 times. Following the assault, he was heard stating, quote, "Every single one of those Capitol law enforcement officers, death is the remedy. That's the only remedy they get." In July of 2023, Steger was sentenced to over 4 years in prison after pleading guilty to assaulting police with a dangerous weapon. Pardoned. Joseph Padilla, who threw a flagpole at a police officer's head during the riot making contact. Prior to the event, he had expressed intentions on social media to, quote, "take over the Capitol building." In September 2023, Padilla was sentenced to more than 6 years in prison after being convicted of assault with a dangerous weapon and other charges. Pardoned. Michael Perkins, who assaulted multiple U.S. Capitol police officers by striking them in the head with a flagpole. In August of 2023, Perkins was sentenced to 4 years in prison after being found guilty of assaulting a federal officer with a dangerous or deadly weapon and other offenses. In total, 140 police officers were injured on January 6th. And on top of those pardons, Enrique Tarrio, the former leader of the Proud Boys, was pardoned despite being sentenced to 22 years in federal prison after he was convicted of seditious conspiracy. And Stuart Rhodes, founder of the far-right militia group Oath Keepers, received a commutation despite being sentenced to 18 years in prison for seditious conspiracy. These pardons are disgusting. I simply cannot think of another word. Legally, there is nothing to be done. The president's pardon power is essentially absolute and unreviewable. I'm making this video for future historians who will probably treat January 6th as a minor footnote rather than the monumental, paradigm-shifting event that it should have been. But I won't blame them because many in this country simply decided to shrug it off. It could have been the impetus to punish the guilty, those inside and outside the White House. But both politicians and voters failed the test. My only hope is that other Americans recognize the travesty of justice that President Trump just visited upon them, and that they remember next time they vote and pick up a history book.